She told me to close the file. I asked her to open her heart. That night, everything between us changed. The office was never this quiet during the day. By 9 o'clock, it had turned into something else entirely. A place of echoes and small sounds that didn't belong to working hours. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights above, the distant whir of the copier in sleep mode, the faint smell of overbrewed coffee lingering from the afternoon. It was the kind of silence that let you notice things you'd usually miss. I looked up from my screen and saw her, my boss, Mrs. Hartley, though she'd always told us to just call her Claire. 42, maybe 43, though time had been kind to her in the way it's kind to some people. It didn't make them look younger, just more certain. Her dark hair was tied up loosely, a few strands slipping free to frame her face. The pale desk lamp cast a warm edge over her cheekbone, highlighting the faint crease beside her mouth where she bit her lip while reading. She didn't know I was watching, not really watching, just noticing. The way her fingers traced the margin of the report, as if feeling the words, the way she adjusted her glasses with a small sigh. There was no one else left on this floor, and I wondered why she stayed so late every night. Was it dedication, or was it something else? Loneliness has a way of hiding behind busy schedules. I felt my own shoulders tense. I was 25, still in that restless place between wanting to prove myself and wanting something more human than late hours and glowing screens. She, on the other hand, seemed carved from composure, yet I had seen the tiredness in her eyes lately. It wasn't the kind of tired that comes from lack of sleep. It was the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. I closed my laptop softly, letting the lid rest without a sound. The office was dim except for her desk light and the faint spill of moonlight through the tall windows. Her coat hung on the back of her chair. She hadn't moved in an hour. "Claire," I said quietly, almost testing how her name sounded at this hour. She looked up, a little startled, as if she had forgotten someone else was here. "Yes?" Her voice was low, smooth, a little hoarse from the day. "Do you ever take a break?" I asked, half smiling. It wasn't a challenge, more of a question I already knew the answer to. Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. "Someone has to make sure this place keeps running." I nodded, but the air felt different after that, less like employee and boss, more like two people stranded in the same quiet night. I didn't dare say more. There's a certain line you don't cross when you admire someone from a respectful distance. But that night, sitting in that cold office, I realized how close that line really was. Just a few feet of polished floor, a few unspoken words, and a woman who carried the world on her shoulders, not knowing someone had already started noticing the cracks. The rain had started an hour ago, soft at first, then persistent. The kind that drummed against the tall glass panes of the office windows and turned the city lights into a blur of silver streaks. Most people had gone home early because of it. By the time I looked up from my desk, it was just the two of us again. Claire sat across the room, her posture still composed, but her movements told a different story tonight, slower, distracted. I heard a quiet sigh from her corner as she shifted through a stack of files, her fingers tracing the pages, then stopping, then starting again. Something wasn't aligning the way it usually did for her. Claire wasn't the kind of woman to fumble, not with work. She had that polished, unshakable efficiency. But now, the rain outside seemed to mirror the small storm within her. "Need a hand?" I asked, pushing my chair back gently so it didn't scrape the floor. She didn't look up right away. "I'm fine," she murmured, though her brow stayed furrowed. I walked over anyway, stopping beside her desk, close enough to catch the faint scent of her perfume, something warm and understated, like cedarwood with a hint of something floral. The kind of fragrance you noticed only when the world slowed down. "What's wrong with it?" I asked, nodding at the folder she kept turning over. Claire exhaled through her nose, a little laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just a misfiled report. It's nothing dramatic, but I can't seem to focus tonight." I reached for the folder at the same moment she did. Our fingers brushed, just a second of skin on skin, but it felt like the air caught between us. Warm. Real. Her fingers withdrew first, slow and deliberate, like she hadn't expected the touch to matter. "Sorry," I said softly, more out of reflex than apology. She shook her head, a strand of dark hair slipping loose and resting against her cheek. "No, it's fine. I guess I'm a little off tonight." I glanced at her, really glanced, and noticed how tired her eyes were beneath the glow of the desk lamp. Not the kind of tired sleep fixes. "You've been here too much lately," I said. "Everyone else leaves, but you stay. Every night." That earned me a look, not annoyed, not defensive, just surprised that someone had noticed. "I suppose it's easier than going home sometimes," she said quietly. There it was, the small crack in her polished shell. Not a confession, just a glimpse. The rain tapped harder against the glass. The office smelled faintly of paper and cold air drifting in from the vents. I felt the urge to say something else, something warmer, but I didn't. I let the silence stretch instead, because sometimes silence feels like the only space where something true can start to breathe. The clock on the wall ticked past 10. The rain had eased, but the office still carried that late-hour hush, the kind that made every movement feel amplified. I found myself in the break room, waiting for the coffee machine to finish its half-hearted hum. That's when she walked in, Claire, holding an empty mug, her shoulders a little lower than usual, the faintest crease between her brows. She didn't seem startled to see me there, just tired. "Still here?" she asked, her voice warm but frayed around the edges. I smiled faintly, tapping the side of my mug. "Waiting for this thing to prove it still works. Want one?" She considered, then gave a small nod. "Tea if there's any left. Something light." I rummaged through the box of tea bags, chamomile, worn and forgotten at the back. I handed it to her, and for the first time that day, her lips curved in something close to a real smile. "Thanks," she said, filling the cup with steaming water. The room filled with the soft scent of herbs, mingling with the faint bitterness of old coffee. For a moment, we stood there, me leaning against the counter, her at the sink, stirring the tea absently. Her eyes weren't on the cup. They were somewhere far off, maybe past the rain-streaked windows, maybe in the kind of place people don't talk about at work. "Tough week?" I asked quietly. She let out a breath, not quite a sigh. "Tough year," she said, and then chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Sorry. That's not very professional of me, is it?" I shrugged. "Professionalism doesn't erase being human." She glanced at me then, one eyebrow slightly raised, as if surprised by the gentleness in my tone. There was something in her expression, a flicker of relief that someone had said it out loud. "You always seem calm," she said, almost musing to herself. "Even when everything's a mess." "Maybe I just hide it well," I replied. That earned me another brief smile, this one softer, less guarded. She leaned back against the counter beside me, the edge of her sleeve brushing against my arm. It wasn't intentional, but she didn't move away either. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was steady, like the kind you find in places where people stop pretending for a minute. I looked at her, really looked, and noticed how the steam from the tea softened her features, how her fingers wrapped around the cup not for its taste, but its warmth. "You deserve a pause too, you know," I said quietly, nodding toward her untouched tea. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cup, and she didn't look at me right away. "I've forgotten how to, I think," she murmured. I wanted to say more, to offer something beyond tea and tired smiles, but I let the moment hold itself. Because for the first time, I saw her not as the woman behind the desk, not as my boss, but as someone quietly waiting for the world to slow down with her. The office was still waking up when I arrived the next morning, the soft whir of computers starting up, the faint aroma of fresh coffee seeping through the air. Pale light spilled in through the wide windows, tinting everything in a muted gold. Claire was already there. She always was. Her blazer hung neatly on the back of her chair, and a stack of files sat in front of her like a silent challenge. "Morning," I said as I set my bag down. She looked up briefly, her expression composed, though her eyes still carried the residue of a sleepless night. "Morning," she echoed, voice low and clipped. We were preparing for a presentation, one of those high-stakes deadlines that demanded more than hours, demanded a piece of you. I had stayed late the night before fine-tuning the figures, thinking she'd appreciate it. But as I placed the revised schedule on her desk, her brow furrowed. "This isn't what I asked for," she said, tapping the document with a manicured nail. I frowned slightly, leaning in. "It's what we discussed, isn't it? I adjusted the timeline so we don't burn everyone out." She pushed the paper back toward me, the movement sharper than it needed to be. "We don't have the luxury of slowing down. The client wants it by Friday." The words were precise, professional, but the edge in her tone was new. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, exactly. More like a line being drawn in a place where there hadn't been one before. "I stayed until 11 working on this," I said quietly. "I thought it would help." Claire's hand stilled on the desk. For a moment, the mask slipped, just a fraction. Her shoulders softened, then straightened again. "You're here to work, not worry about me," she said, her voice firm now, measured. That landed like a cold drop of rain down my back. She wasn't being cruel. She was protecting something, or maybe protecting herself from something. I stepped back slightly, the distance between us suddenly feeling heavier than the polished floor could account for. "I wasn't," I said after a pause. "I was trying to make things a little less impossible for you. For all of us." She looked up at that, really looked at me. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, guilt, maybe, or the ache of someone who knows they've built a wall they don't entirely want. "I appreciate your effort," she said finally, softer now. "But there's a line here. Don't blur it." I nodded slowly, swallowing the words I wanted to say, that the line had already blurred, not by my choice alone, but by the nights we stayed, the quiet talks over tea, the moments she let herself be human. The meeting proceeded as planned, the office buzzed back to life, and yet the air between us stayed heavy, like the pause before a storm that doesn't know whether it wants to break or pass quietly by. By the time the office emptied that night, the city outside had settled into a rhythm of distant car horns and the muted glow of streetlights. It was nearly 10. The fluorescent ceiling lights were turned off in most of the building, leaving only the soft pool of her desk lamp spilling across a sea of paperwork. Claire sat there, glasses perched low, one hand propping up her temple as her eyes scanned another report. The rain had stopped hours ago, but a film of damp clung to the windows, softening the view of the skyline. I lingered by the doorway, my own work long finished, yet something kept me from leaving. I watched the way her fingers moved over the documents, quick, efficient, but with a certain weight behind them tonight, like every decision cost a little more than it used to. "Still at it?" I asked finally, my voice breaking the hush. She looked up, and for the first time in weeks, the composure cracked just slightly. "Just one more file," she murmured. "Then I'll call it a night." I stepped closer, the quiet sound of my shoes on the polished floor filling the distance between us. "You've said that 3 times this week," I said gently. Claire gave a faint, weary smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Someone has to keep this place running." I leaned a hand against the edge of her desk, close but careful. The lamplight cast half her face in warmth, the other in shadow. "You keep saying that as if you're the only one who can." She paused, fingers resting on a page, her breath catching slightly. For a moment neither of us moved, the whole room felt suspended between duty and something neither of us wanted to name. Then, quietly, she said it. "Close that file, we're done for tonight." It should have been the end of the evening, the cue to leave, to let her slip back into her solitude. But something in me refused to let it close like that. My voice came before I could measure it. "And open yourself to me." The words didn't land with force. They settled like dust in the air, soft, fragile, but undeniable. Her hands stilled over the papers. Slowly, her eyes lifted to mine. In that moment, the office disappeared. It was just her gaze, steady but shaken, and my heartbeat thudding in the hollow quiet. She didn't speak right away. The silence stretched, not awkward but full, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. I could see the conflict flicker in her expression, the authority she carried, the loneliness she hid, and the sudden presence of something that neither of us had fully admitted until now. "Careful," she whispered finally, her voice thin as glass. "That's a dangerous thing to say." I nodded slightly, but didn't step back. "I know," I said. "So is staying silent." The file lay open between us, forgotten. The night air outside felt cooler than I expected, carrying the faint scent of wet pavement and distant rain. The office door clicked shut behind us, leaving the building's hum behind. Claire walked a step ahead, her heels striking the concrete softly, her coat draped over her arm rather than worn. Neither of us spoke at first. The city was quieter at this hour, shop fronts dim, cars passing like slow-moving shadows. I matched my pace with hers, hands tucked in my pockets, the echo of what I'd said still hanging between us. "Do you usually stay this late?" she asked finally, her voice steady but quieter than usual. "Only when you do," I said, a small, almost nervous smile tugging at my lips. "Or maybe because you do." She glanced at me briefly, something flickering behind her eyes, surprise, maybe, or a trace of warmth she was trying not to show. We stopped near the parking area where her car waited, silver under the soft glow of a streetlight. For a moment, the city felt miles away. "You shouldn't say things like that," she murmured, turning the keys in her hand. "It complicates things." "Maybe they were already complicated," I replied gently. She turned then, really looking at me. There was no shield in her gaze this time, just a tired woman, elegant still, but not untouchable. The kind of look that makes you forget roles and titles. A strand of hair had slipped from her bun, catching the breeze. Without thinking too much, I reached up and brushed it lightly back behind her ear. My fingers barely grazed her skin, warm, smooth, softer than I expected. She didn't pull away. In fact, she let out a small laugh, low, almost nervous, the kind that belongs to someone who isn't used to being seen like this. "You're braver than you should be," she said. "Or just tired of pretending I don't notice you," I answered. The air between us was cool, but where we stood felt strangely still. Her hand rested on the car door, fingers tracing the metal edge absent-mindedly, as though she were stalling. "I don't know what this is," she whispered, almost to herself. "Neither do I," I admitted. "But it feels honest." Her eyes softened then, and for a brief moment, the distance that had been a wall all these weeks became something else, a space waiting to be crossed. She stepped a little closer, not enough to close it entirely, but enough that I could feel the faint brush of her coat sleeve against my hand. "I can't promise anything," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to," I replied. "Just don't shut the door before we know what's behind it." A car passed in the distance, headlights sweeping over us and fading. She exhaled slowly, nodded once, and unlocked her car. "Good night," she said. But the way her eyes lingered, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a pause. The morning light poured into the office the next day, soft and golden, cutting long shapes across the polished floor. It was a different kind of morning, quieter, lighter, as if the world had taken a deep breath after the night before. Claire was already at her desk, her hair tied neatly, a faint trace of something unreadable in her expression. I paused at the doorway, unsure whether to pretend nothing had happened or to acknowledge everything that had. My fingers brushed against the doorframe, grounding myself before stepping in. "Morning," I said gently. She looked up. For a heartbeat, her usual professionalism flickered, replaced by something warmer, more fragile. "Morning," she replied. There was no storm in her voice, no wall raised overnight. Just a quiet, deliberate steadiness. I took that as my opening and set a cup of coffee on her desk, her usual, the way she liked it. She raised an eyebrow. "Bribery? Consider it a peace offering," I said with a faint smile. Her lips curved, a real smile this time. She reached for the cup, her fingers brushing against mine for a fraction of a second, and didn't pull back immediately. "It wasn't an accident. About last night," she began, then stopped, her gaze dropping briefly to the papers in front of her. "I didn't mean to push." I said quickly. I just didn't want to keep pretending I didn't care. Her eyes lifted to mine, steady now. I know. And maybe that's what scared me. There was a pause, not heavy, just full of everything that didn't need to be rushed. The office was waking up around us, distant phones ringing, the faint click of heels in the hallway. But in that moment, it felt like we were somewhere else entirely. I've spent years making sure nothing and no one gets too close, she said finally. It's easier to manage work than it is people. I'm not asking you to change that overnight, I replied softly. I just want to be one of the reasons it doesn't have to stay that way forever. Her expression softened at that, the faintest shimmer of vulnerability showing beneath the lines of control. She placed her hand over mine, palm warm, fingers gentle but sure. Then we take it slowly, she said. No drama, no games. Just see where this goes. Slow sounds perfect, I said, feeling the tension that had followed us for weeks finally loosen. The day moved on, meetings, calls, the usual noise, but it felt different now. The air wasn't heavy anymore. There was a quiet thread between us, not loud or obvious, but steady. When the evening came, she waited for me by the door, coat already in hand. No words, just a glance that said, "Come with me." We walked out together this time. Not as boss and employee caught in the late hours, but as two people beginning something honest, something careful, something real.